Good morning, Lucas. How are you?
Good morning. Great. Good to see you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. It's a pleasure. And you've watched and listened to a few of these already, so you know this, but it's a series of conversations about, I guess, the two deepest and I think most important philosophical questions: what's real and what and who gets to matter in our ethical systems. So I'm framing that with an obvious bias because I'm trying to normalize and popularize this very simple worldview called Sentientism, which says when it comes to thinking about what's real, we should use evidence and reason in a naturalistic approach. And when it comes to who gets to count ethically, the clue is in the name that we should have moral consideration for all sentient beings, any being that has the capacity to experience suffering or flourishing. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who disagree and agree with that worldview and that way of thinking. So it's going to be fascinating to find out a bit more about your own philosophical journey and where you've got to now and what you think we should do about it. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself to people who haven't come across your work already?
Most recently, I'm an author and a social enterprise entrepreneur, though it's kind of a circuitous route to get there. I was trained as an architect and worked in architecture for a number of years, including abroad. I'm from the US, but worked in Canada and in India. And then in 2016, I left everything and I traveled the world for almost 2 years. Ended up volunteering at a lot of animal sanctuaries in various countries, and ended up writing a book about that called The Weight of Empathy, and self-published it almost exactly a year ago. I also, upon returning, decided not to go back to architecture. I decided to commit myself to something more impactful and beneficial to the world. Still figuring out what that is and what that looks like, but my first go at it was to start a philanthropic enterprise, which was a vegan dog treat company that donated 100% of its profits to animal sanctuaries. So unfortunately, though that was rather successful, it did not weather the tumult of COVID, and at the end of 2020 had to wind that down. So I'm not sure if my previous identities will carry through. So, but that's currently how I would describe myself and what I've been doing lately.
Well, thank you. It's a fascinating path. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what you move on to do next. I've had the privilege of, I haven't read every word yet of The Weight of Empathy, but I've had a chance to read some sections of it and flick through it. And it's a beautiful piece of work. And I think it's maybe going to set the context for some of the conversation we have now, because you've had an amazing experience of traveling around the world, meeting a variety of different people that I think will have, radically different perspectives on some of the different philosophical questions we're going to ask here. So it's going to be interesting to understand your personal perspective, but also what you've learned from what must have been a mind-blowing experience over those 2 years. So let's come on to that, the first of those two big questions: what's real, or what should we believe, and how should we go about it? And for many of my guests, that's a story about I guess the context they originally grew up in. Was it quite naturalistic, maybe scientifically minded, atheistic or agnostic, maybe as a family context, or one that was more spiritual or religious? And how is their thinking about, the nature of reality and how to go about choosing what to believe? How has that changed over time? So you can wind the clock back as far as you like, but it'd be fascinating to know your story.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that most of the time that I've spent recently, at least, thinking about this question has been while listening to your podcast and hearing you ask other people and thinking about how I would answer that even before you agreed to have me as a guest. So yeah, it's interesting. I don't have a super possibly coherent or concise answer, but my parents were or are non-religious. My mother came from a Catholic background. I think probably still identifies as a recovering Catholic, kind of tongue-in-cheek. My father's from a Jewish family, but I don't know if he even celebrated like Jewish holidays growing up. We certainly didn't. So we kind of, celebrated Christmas and Easter, but just for the tradition and the activities, not so much because anything to do with Jesus or Christianity, So my parents were definitely hippies. They met in a macrobiotic cooking class in the 70s, early 70s. And yeah, so I was kind of raised on a hippie commune as a small child. And yeah, it's definitely very different from, some of your other guests who I've heard talk about more like strict religious upbringings, which is obviously rather common. So I've been thinking back and trying to sort of pinpoint some moments or things that maybe my parents told me that influenced my beliefs in that way, but it was left pretty open-ended for me, which I appreciate. Kind of vaguely remember, maybe when I was 8 or something like that, my mother saying something to the extent of like, God is everywhere or in everything or something like that. Kind of a pretty relatively like secular way of talking about God, or I guess spiritualism. So I would say from the moment that I knew the word, I probably identified as an atheist, though it was not really. I was thinking about the terminology. It was not really in opposition to religion. It was more, I would say the way people think about atheism might be better described as anti-theism.
Yeah.
But atheism is just like lack of, like absence of God rather than like opposition to.
Yeah.
So I always thought the framing was not really that useful, because it is only, it's a way of identifying yourself as not being a part of this group that is kind of irrelevant to your worldview.
Yeah.
Like,
and in another context, you wouldn't feel the need to even make that statement clear. I mean, there are so many things that, for example, you and I don't believe in, but we don't feel the need to identify as not having a belief in those things. It's just, I guess, because of the social force and the widespread acceptance of theism that atheism becomes a thing. And, maybe eventually it won't be so much, but you can't really generalize about the sort of hippie style culture. But I think it's very common that in those sorts of movements and those sorts of mindsets, which are very present today, the rejection of a sort of institutional religion is quite common because it was part of a general pushing back against, authority and hierarchy and structure and conservatism and the establishment. So there's quite often a strong rejection of established religions.
Right.
And sometimes that leaves people in a, naturalistic place, but sometimes, as you hinted at with some of the things maybe your mum said, there can be another path of spirituality without religion, a sense of still some sort of mysticism or transcendence or a connection. And that's been interesting to explore with my guests as well, because you can almost use the same word in a naturalistic way or one that does actually have some sort of sense of the supernatural and the magical about it.
Yeah, so I would say I was kind of raised in that environment where there was, I wouldn't say superstition, but some sort of, I guess I would say, woo-woo spirituality. Like tarot cards and divination and that sort of thing. Almost the sort of like magical end of like spirituality. But I always kind of had just a very open mind about, I guess, about what is real. And certainly I would say I have always had a sort of rational, logical way of looking at things and determining what's right, but from the starting point of a lot of open-mindedness. So the example I was thinking of the other day is like, when I was a kid, I practiced like levitating myself and like telekinesis and things like that. Not because I was sure that this like magic existed, but just because like that was the best way for me to find out, is like if I could figure out how to do it.
Do an experiment.
If I couldn't, that would be like pretty decent evidence after some good effort that that wasn't real or possible, So
And how high did you get in the levitation in the end? What were the results of the experiment?
It was not very successful, to say that. But
and how about getting the pencil to roll itself across the desk? Did that,
either. I wasn't able to bend any spoons, or
yeah, frustrating. But it's interesting because I came out of a very sort of anodyne, quite boring English Christianity, so it wasn't a strong force in our lives. But I remember actually around the same time as I was giving it up and moving away from Christianity, I still had this fascination with many of those aspects, like the paranormal and telekinesis, and I sort of remember going through a phase of a few years of it's almost wishful thinking, hoping that some of that stuff was true, but then increasingly coming to the conclusion that it just I remain open-minded about the possibility of things, but until there's evidence to support their existence, I'm not going to give any credence to them. So
yeah, I think I would say I am a rationalist, but I think religion or spirituality still can be worthwhile. And specifically, I would say, well, religion is good for architecture. There's a lot of, temples and churches and the like that are pretty remarkable. Feats of engineering and design that I appreciate and would not be around if it weren't for religion. It can be good for bringing people together. Obviously, can be good for or bad for separating people as well. But I would say it's as legitimate a place as any to look for guidance around the unexplainable. The problem being that what is unexplainable changes, and people tend to cling to their religion or spirituality, even in the presence of evidence that should direct them elsewhere. So, before we had, telescopes and mathematics and the ability to like understand what the cosmos was, these stories that people made up, the narratives that people made up to make sense of the world, like that's as valid as any any way to try and understand the unexplainable. And I think there still are things that are unexplainable. And so in some ways, like rationality or science is not necessarily better at explaining some of those things than others, as long as there's some reason and logic behind when you would turn to these other ways of creating a narrative or an explanation.
Yeah, and I think there's two risks for me. One is that we're too quick to classify something as unexplainable in principle, when we don't yet know, right? We might be able to find out more. So I guess my one appeal is just don't write a question off too early as unexplainable, because who knows? Let's keep trying to find out. And I guess the other one is, if something is maybe unexplainable, but certainly unexplained at the moment, it seems to me super healthy just to be able to live with that uncertainty rather than fabricating something to fill the gap because we don't feel good having some uncertainty. And I think as long as we can be careful about those two traps, writing off an area as in principle unexplainable, therefore we give up and we stop, or we put a fabricated answer in its place, again, so we stop because we already have the answer, then I think we can be super open-minded, but be comfortable that being open-minded means, there's stuff we don't know and there's stuff we might never know, but let's keep trying to work it out in the meantime.
Yeah, I think the open-mindedness is key to that. And I am fascinated by and appreciative of modern technology and science. And so I don't feel like I'm at risk of just like, romanticizing the unknown or something. And I appreciate that science and research is doing incredible things and is accelerating. And I'm excited to see, for the most part, excited to see where it goes or what's possible. And yeah, I think there are times when you need to have some sort of explanation or some sort of framework or narrative in order to make a decision. And that's where you have to turn somewhere, even if science is not providing an answer at the moment. But that's different than, like I said, romanticizing and clinging to this idea of the mystical or unexplained.
Yeah. So I think we share a sort of open-minded naturalism. It sounds like that's roughly where you sort of started off, although there was a bit of woo and some other stuff going on that you've, let go, but you're still open-minded about. So no, that's been fascinating.
I would say then the other things that influenced me, I guess, going into my teenage and young adulthood years, would be reading some philosophy. Specifically, Alan Watts was pretty influential. I think he's an American guy who wrote about sort of Eastern philosophies. I say that broadly, but he did write about a variety of different philosophies, Zen and Taoism and the like. And that was quite influential, as well as my experiences with hallucinogenics, specifically mushrooms. Those experiences really influenced my hybrid rationalist spiritual view of the world.
Yeah. And did they, because one of the interesting things about hallucinogenics, and I've never experienced them myself, so there's a degree to which I'm speaking from a point of view of complete naivety, but it seems to me that from the people I've talked to, people who've either worked with hallucinogenics or as well have worked at quite an advanced level on meditative practices, for example. I'm not saying they're the same at all, but they seem to have some commonality in that people with a naturalistic way of thinking can either go through those paths and come out with a radically different way of thinking, but they still have a naturalistic worldview because those things have just taught them something about the incredible plasticity and flexibility of our own perceptual mechanisms, our own minds. With others, it's actually taken them away from naturalism in a sense and said, I have seen new realms. Reality is different from how I understood it. And my understanding before was limited. It'd be interesting to understand how your perspective shifted as a result of that experience.
I mean, I think I can't quite speak to the parallels between meditation and hallucinogens, though I've heard this similar thing. I'm just not that good or advanced at meditation to say. It is really something that is hard or impossible to fully grasp without firsthand experience. And obviously I just met you, but I would generally recommend mushrooms to people. I think it is can be an extremely illuminating and enriching experience. For me, I would say it allowed a change in perspective to see connections where they were previously obscured, or I don't know, to glimpse the essential nature of things, if that makes sense, and also to feel in a really visceral way the ways in which I am connected to and a part of the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
yeah. From the people who've talked to me, there's the sense of connectedness, of oneness.
Yeah. So I mean, there's this whole thing about Carl Sagan talking about how we are the stuff of stars, and that's that is something that I actually think about fairly often. Just that all the atoms in our bodies and these computers and cameras were once in a cloud of interstellar dust that, because of some chaotic ripple in the cloud, they coalesced into our solar system, and that is all we were to begin with, And so, how did we get from there to where we are? And I don't believe in a deity or intelligent design or this sort of thing. Certainly not a God that is in the form of a human man,
Yeah.
but there is a kind of, I mean, I don't know how you want to describe it, a magic or even an intelligence that that shaped those dynamics. I mean, I don't know if that phrasing is even accurate, because it sounds like external forces, but what I'm saying is like there's an inherent quality in matter, in these little pieces of interstellar dust, that is self-organizing. And to the point where not only can it go from a dispersed cloud of dust into a clump of rock, but into a star that creates its own heat, and into all of these elements, and can, create more and more complex elements, and then can create life itself, and eventually sentience. And so one of the things that stuck with me from the writing of Alan Watts was, if I recall, him basically saying that humans, or I would say any sentient being, is the creation of a sentient being is a way for the universe to observe itself.
Mm.
And so sort of pairing that with my experience of hallucinogens is kind of this idea that this inherent self-organizing intelligence of matter itself, which is the universe, created our world, or became our world, as a way for us as in everything, to like observe itself. So that in a way is not, it's not superstitious or religious or anti-rationalist, but it is still a framework for me to think about what is real, and what I am, what the world is, and
to think about meaning, I guess, as well. Yeah.
So that, for me, what I get out of that is, in terms of the big question of like the meaning of life, or what my purpose is as an entity that exists, is I, as in these atoms, could have been born as a rock, or more likely plasma in the sun. And instead, I was born, or came into the world, as a sentient being. And so for me, as an expression of the universe observing itself, to take that for granted would be a travesty. So that is sort of half of my answer to the meaning of life, and I think the other half might be addressed in your subsequent questions.
Yeah, thank you. You put that beautifully. And I guess I have a more sort of boring, classical Carl Sagan way of describing that path. But in a sense, there's still, I think, quite a lot of commonality there, because, as you say, you might talk about the inherent sort of direction of the universe and creating sentient beings to observe itself. That doesn't necessarily involve some outside force or being shaping it directly or deliberately to do something. It doesn't mean the universe itself even having the capacity to have that intent to go that direction. You could describe that same inherent capability, in my sense, as a really boring deterministic application of the laws of physics that, drive patterns that are good at persisting and replicating into persisting and replicating, and here we are. So in a way, it feels like a very different way of describing the world, but there's still some commonality in there.
I think it's just a lot of semantics, and maybe maybe if you took mushrooms, you would describe the same thing in a different way. But I think that, I don't know, I've heard you talk with other guests about how, like, you don't need magic or religion because the way the world exists is amazing enough. and I completely agree with that. But I think it's, like I said, it's almost a matter of semantics if you describe something as a law of physics or as magic in a way, because there's, I mean, and maybe this is something that to my mind is unexplainable, but that's in a couple hundred years will be taught to small children. But even just, the power of gravity or magnetism or any of these things, even if is pure chance, the fact that, water expands when it freezes, unlike most other substances, just completely changed the nature of our world and allows for life itself to exist, or even for planets to exist. And so I'm happy to entertain this framework of these laws setting the sort of pool balls in motion, bouncing off each other and random chance. But there are these laws, if you will, that, I sort of described it as an innate intelligence or self-organizing force. You might describe it as just happenstance, but there's no reason that the universe should be assumed to have been created with the force of gravity, the constant of gravity being what it is and not double what it is or half what it is, which would change, everything, or all of these like forces of nature, like laws of physics. They are what they are. And there's this like chaos that springs forth from them. But I don't know, there's no reason that they should exist in a way that allows life or self-organization to exist. And so I don't think of it as there being a God who's, decided there should be life. And that was the like intention set forth. And then he decided that he would set these bowling balls.
Yeah. And then wait 13.8 billion years until Lucas appears. Yeah.
Exactly. But there is, I don't know, to my mind, and maybe this is just something that I will be disabused of once science explains it better. But it seems that, I don't know, some mystical quality to the fact that matter is self-organizing in our universe.
Whether it's mystical or not, we might disagree on, but there's certainly still mystery there. Whether it can be solved or not is different. And even if you dig into the formal physics, and I'm an amateur in that field as well as in philosophy, but there's still plenty of weirdness there, right? So one of the very real schools of thought in physics is that there are multiple worlds, and in that context, maybe most of the universes don't have laws that are conducive to sentient beings, and they are random mixes of some weird version of quarks that never do anything interesting. And by definition, because we're here observing this universe, of course, we're in one of the ones that happen to be fine-tuned enough just through dumb luck to drive. So who knows, right? There's so much weirdness even in formal scientific physics. So yeah, I find it fascinating. We're probably not going to fix it here, but yeah, I like the open-mindedness, and it's a fascinating field where sort of philosophy and physics tie together, and both, I think, remain mystified and confused, and a sense of open-minded sort of readiness for wonder and a curiosity to keep finding out more is probably the best approach. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's come on to that. Let's leave that mystery there. And maybe we should come back and do another conversation once I've experimented with mushrooms, and I'll be talking about cosmic direction and the connectedness of all things and the eternal, spirit that we are all part of, teleologically driven towards. So let's put that on the back burner for the moment. And let's come on to the second question that you touched on already, which is, that's about what's real and how should we go about choosing what to believe and how should we grant credences in things and our understanding of reality. Equally important is ethics and morality and what matters. And for someone who has a more naturalistic way of thinking, often there's a challenge, which is, okay, well, if you don't have the Quran or the Bible or the principles of the Bhagavad Gita, or you don't have a list of rules or a deity to judge good and bad, is there any morality at all? What do you base your morality on? So maybe that's a good place to start. Is again, you can wind the clock back about your ethical thinking, right and wrong, good and bad, justice. How did that side of your thinking evolve over time?
Yeah, I don't know. I've always been a pretty, like, even from a young age, quite a sensitive, kind of empathetic person. And always sort of on the more pacifistic end of things. Obviously, it's hard to sort of parse what is, sort of random or genetic, and what was the influence of my peers or environment or parents. I could try to trace that back, or speculate about my parents' religions, or there's some communist ancestors from my Russian side that I feel like is sort of aligned with this idea of valuing sort of justice and equality. Yeah, it's hard for me to trace that back too far. I guess the things that I can more identify, I always had a kind of affinity with non-human animals, from the chickens that my family raised in our backyard in Missouri when I was 4 years old, to the dogs and cats that we had as pets, as well as wild animals, the charismatic megafauna, if you will.
Yeah. And in a way, that's almost the second part of this question, because the first one is, what's ethics grounded in? And some people have crazily complicated answers to that, and there are philosophers who spent hundreds of years answering that question. But for me, the essence of it is pretty much as you laid out. Whatever formal ethics or morality you might adopt, the core of it has to be some form of concern for the experiences of another being, and whether you experience that as an emotional thing, you feel their pain and you care about them, or whether it's just an intellectual thing where you think, well, I care about my own suffering, why shouldn't I care about that of others? It sort of doesn't matter, right? As long as there's that central compassion there, that seems like an appropriate naturalistic grounding for ethics. But
yeah, I think that there's maybe not as much focus on the distinction between personalities as maybe there should be. I have always been, like I said, rational and logical, but also quite a emotional person. And so I think presumably for some people, logic is all that is needed in order to, if they connect the dots between A and B and C, then they can just instantly transform their lives because it makes logical sense. I think for myself, and I think many others, there needs to be some emotional impetus or connection that is made. And so for me, I think that empathy is extremely important in that regard. I was just listening to your interview with Franz de Waal, and he said something similar about empathy being the sort of foundation upon which ethics must be built. And it doesn't matter how solid your logic is. If you don't have empathy, then you don't care. You don't care if it makes sense. And I very much agree with that. I think that there are one reason why it can be frustrating to care about and advocate for animals is because I think the logic is not that complicated for why we should, and yet people still carry on eating them and paying for their mistreatment.
And that's the second question, because I think almost everybody would agree that compassion at least plays some part in ethics and morality. And I think almost everybody feels it and has it for some people. But the critical question then is, okay, who warrants our compassion and who gets that compassion? Because, even most serial killers love their mothers, right? And most humans care about their families and have compassion for at least their in-group. But that question of moral scope and who's included is a really challenging one, both because of our evolutionary past, if you like, has sort of given us the raw materials of compassion. I think non-human animals felt genuine compassion for their young, for example, or their family members long before humans came on the scene, and we've got that too. But just that evolutionary gift of somewhat limited compassion, normally to a family or an in-group, isn't sufficient for the morality that you and I hold now. So it would be interesting to know how you went through that journey of thinking about moral scope, both in terms of caring about other humans that you haven't come across or lived in different places or were different from you, but also critically, as you've started to talk about already, non-humans. And how did you go through that process of working out that they mattered too?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think I was raised some general sort of values of everyone is important, their lives are important, their suffering is important, whether they live in a faraway land or they're your next door neighbor, whether they look the same as you or they are believe the same things as you. That sort of general sense of equality, I guess. When I was a teenager, I read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, and that was, I would say, with some of those Alan Watts books were among the most formative things that I read or was exposed to growing up. And just due to my general sense of compassion and affinity for animals, I was vegetarian when I was 13 or 14, and this was before the internet. It was a long time ago, but so I didn't really know a lot of the details or specifics, but I generally had this sense that it would be more consistent with my ethics to be vegan, and decided I would try it for a week, and that was almost 29 years ago when I was 16.
Wow.
And
yeah.
And so that was.
And was it because you describe in your book your experiences of having being around animals as a child, but also, as you mentioned, reading Animal Liberation. Was it one or the other, or the combination of the two, that sort of took you down that path of making practical changes? Which, one, it was much harder then than it is today, and two, those are pretty young age to make those decisions and put them in place.
Yeah. Oh, another thing I wrote about in my book is this experience as a kid of the chickens that I talked about, loving, that we raised in our backyard. We also ate them, and this was something that as a 5-year-old or however old I was not an easy thing to reconcile. And like I was saying, with spirituality or religion being a way to create these narratives that help you make sense of the world, I think the same thing is true of when you're a small child. There's a lot more in the world that doesn't make sense to you, and that you have to invent a narrative to make sense of. And so the sort of narrative that I invented in my head as a small child was that that humans are made of skin and fat and muscle and bone, and then non-human animals were made of skin and fat and muscle and bone and this other substance called meat. I was like, they must be just made for there's this thing inside of animals that is food that we call meat, instead of realizing that they are like us and we just eat their muscles. So there was a lot of, I was already sort of predisposed to having compassion for animals and trying to make sense of the situation where we don't treat them well. And so I think once I got old enough to start understanding that, then it was a pretty short leap to say, well, I love animals and I don't want to hurt them, so I'm going to stop eating them.
Yeah, and it's interesting that at the age of 5 or 6, you even felt you needed to make a rationalization at all, because I think for most people at a young age, either we just don't think about it, or the rationalization is simply, this is normal because it's what my family and my friends and my school and my society do, and we don't necessarily think of it any more deeply. So it's interesting that you actually constructed a distinctive narrative in your own mind to make sense of it.
Maybe I was somewhat predisposed to it, but also I think it's partly due to the fact that these were chickens I knew personally. Yeah. And we, my mother still normalized it, but it's not like we were, from a ranching family where it was part of the way we, put a roof over our heads. So we weren't like that invested in it in that way.
And you also weren't just buying a random product from the supermarket and you didn't know where it came from.
So I had the privilege of knowing this chicken, of having held and observed and spent time with this chicken. And then that chicken ended up having their head cut off and ended up on our plates that night. So it was a very, it makes it a lot harder to sustain the kind of cognitive dissonance that I think is required to care about animals and still hurt them.
Yeah. And when you did make those transitions at 13 and 16, what was that transition like for you, I guess, psychologically, practically, socially? What did your parents think? Did it feel like you were making a sacrifice, or?
No, it never felt like a sacrifice. And it was, as you said, it was much more difficult then, but for me, it was relatively easy. Even though I was living in rural Colorado, my mother was managing a health food store. And so for one, I was already familiar with a lot of the alternatives, even though the range of alternatives was much, much smaller.
Yeah.
And I could also go into the health food store and, eat what I wanted off the shelf. So it wasn't the challenge that a lot of people unfortunately have to contend with, of, their parents saying, oh, you're going to, die of malnutrition and we're not going to buy you the, foods that you want and things like this. So it was relatively easy for me logistically. I don't know. I don't remember there being a lot of difficulty in terms of socially, that sort of thing. And like I said, it never felt like a sacrifice. There are things that I wouldn't say that I crave, but I have some positive, nostalgic associations with. And the thing is that the longer, and I think this is a pretty common, if not universal, well, probably not universal, a pretty common experience. The longer that you have some separation from the experience of eating the food, then the weaker or more secondary that association becomes. And so over time, I have come to associate eggs less with the nice food that I remember eating and those nice flavors that I remember, and associating eggs more with chickens and the experience that chickens go through in order for those eggs to be harvested and sold, and the personality and needs and life experience of chickens themselves. And so if my primary association with a animal product is the animal themselves, then it doesn't feel like a sacrifice not to eat it.
Yeah. Thank you. So, is there anything else you wanted to say about the sort of ethical structure? And because it sounds like you and I are in a similar sort of place, then, that we, any in the shorthand is animal, including human, but in any being that has the capacity to suffer or flourish, that can experience things, matters some consideration, and we should do what we can, at least not to needlessly harm them. Is there more you'd add into that conversation? Or
I would say that I am a scientist, but probably not as I don't want to say narrowly in a bad way, but not as like strictly as you are. And I would say that part of that comes from my experience on mushrooms, but
in that you go broader than sentience in terms of thinking about moral consideration.
I would say my I guess pushback would be maybe think in broader terms than moral consideration and think of value. Is there anything in existence or possible existence that is not sentient that has an innate value? And especially my experiences out in nature on mushrooms, certainly my interactions with other sentient beings, human and non-human, are incredible in that setting, but also my experience of the entire world and universe and existence, including all of the non-sentient living and non-living entities, is also feels profound, and there seems to be a beauty in it all. And I know that is maybe I'm painting myself into a corner, because beauty, you could say, only exists as a concept in the presence of a sentient being who can label it such. But I would counter that that beauty, that sort of those forces working together in these systems, these complex systems, that is something that has value, even if it's not specifically the value that I place on it by labeling it beauty.
Yeah. And as you say, you've heard me say this before, but I'm reasonably strict in that I do get this sense that other non-sentient stuff and systems in the universe are valuable instrumentally because of their impact on sentient beings, but not in their own right. But at the same time, I'm not too worried if people want to go beyond that. And I'm almost trying to frame sentientism as saying that you can go beyond sentience, if you like, as long as all sentient beings get serious moral consideration. And I'm probably sort of reworking the concept as I have these conversations, but I would also say that even if you go beyond, it's still important to recognize that the capacity for sentience does have a distinctive additional layer of value or worth over and above non-sentient things as well. And I think my intuition is you're there as well, right? You see a very big difference between harming a pig and cutting a blade of grass, right? Both might matter to you morally because everything does, but there is a difference because of that sentience. Whereas, and you've heard me rant on about this before, there's this sense that some people go much, much broader, but still exclude sentient beings. And I'm like, well, no, I'm much more worried about exclusion of sentience than I am inclusion of things that aren't sentient.
Yeah, no, I think we're pretty aligned there. I think you could argue is a shortcoming of sentientism, but maybe it is just the way that it's useful to think of it more as like ethical guardrails, rather than a framework that explains all of the ethical decisions that you come across. So saying sort of like, as long as we stay within these guardrails, where, as you said, we're given, the full appropriate moral consideration to all sentient beings, then we're at least in a relatively safe starting point to wrestle with these questions. I think to play a little bit of devil's advocate around it, I like to sort of push the question to its sort of logical conclusion, which would be, okay, if there's an entire galaxy that is just teeming with life and complexity for billions of years, like every solar system on every planet is just overflowing with life and ecosystems and for billions of years, and none of those organisms on those planets are sentient in the way that you and I think of it. Would you destroy that galaxy if it meant you could avoid stubbing your toe once? And so, I would stub my toe to preserve that galaxy, it doesn't mean that there's
I would too, and I would come up with a very convincing post-rationalization for why I do that.
Sure.
No, that is a very good. It's an important challenge.
Yeah, so if you're going to be absolutist about something, then I think you need to perform that that sort of mental exercise and say, well, if it's actually absolutist, then it needs to be any sentient experience above all else in the possible universe. And I do think that these non-sentient systems and life and self-organization has, like I said, what I would maybe problematically describe as beauty or intelligence. And I would, in my view, I would assign it some value, some innate value that exists whether or not there's a sentient being to experience it.
I think that's a good challenge, and I think in the same way as we were talking about sort of epistemology earlier on, it makes sense to have some humility and some open-mindedness there. I think we need to have humility about our ethical thinking as well. And yeah, absolutism often leads you to some dangerous places.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's the other sort of challenge to sentientism, which is not necessarily like an argument against, but a challenge for sentientism, is the difficulty in determining what or who is sentient or not, and how much of that is a spectrum, how much of that is just a on or off, yes or no question. I am hesitant to think of it as everyone in this box is sentient and everyone in this box is worthless or meaningless, because I think that almost just reminds me of the sort of religious idea in some teachings that humans have souls and non-humans don't have souls. And so therefore, it's this sort of essential quality of us that we are born with, that is bestowed upon us from above, and no one else possesses it. And we have this special thing, therefore nobody else matters.
There's a simple, easy binary dogma that we can just sort of reassures ourselves, but it isn't grounded in reality.
Yeah, and I think even though sentientism is more inclusive than that, I think there's still a risk of seeing it as this binary thing of sentience or non-sentience. And my intuition's somewhat educated guess is that it's more of a spectrum, and it is quite unexplained on many levels at this stage. And so I think you can have some guiding principles. One of the things I heard Jonathan Safran Foer say in a speech was, even if we don't know exactly the quality of an animal's experience. It doesn't hurt us to be generous in our assumptions, and so I think that can be a good guiding principle of just generosity of what we assume is the experience of others, and what they're capable of. That said,
I agree. Yeah.
You can't just take that. If you take that too far, then you end up saying, well, trees are pretty complex, and so maybe we should give them equal moral weight to animals. That said, I think there's a lot that we're continuing to learn, the things even specifically that we've learned about trees and the way that they communicate with other trees through the use of the fungus in the ground and things like this is really remarkable, and they're really much more complex, interrelated organisms than we imagined. And that's not the same as sentience, but I don't think there's a reason to think it's not on the same spectrum. So maybe that sort of information could have us reassess our priors to think, well, maybe on that spectrum, trees are a little closer to us than rocks, at least compared to our previous assumptions. And when it comes to other animals, obviously, I think there's some really difficult and really important questions to answer in terms, especially in terms of insects. How sentient are they? How sentient are different insects compared to each other? And how does that affect the moral weight that they're given? One interesting thing that, speaking of different cultures around the world, that I sort of ran into in my travels, Jainism was a quite an interesting one to get acquainted with. There's a Jain holy city that I went to that's a completely vegetarian city. It's against the law to Palitana, against the law to kill animals or raise them to be killed. And so I went there and checked it out. So it's a long story, which I wrote about in my book, but it was fascinating and learning a little bit about Jainism, and again, these different ways that people came to a similar conclusion about compassion for animals or nonviolence, or ahimsa as they call it. And from what I recall, though I'm probably not super accurate, as I'm not Jain myself, is that they assess this essentially sentience by how many senses an organism has. So if an organism has, sight and hearing and touch and smell, then that might be a more sentient organism than others. And so you could say that some organisms, some simple animals, or even complex plants, you could say that they have, one or two or three senses in some way. And in that way, they are deserving more moral consideration than a rock or a simple, bacteria or something like that.
Yeah, and I think and where I try and keep it as a very basic platform is just to say that the capacity to suffer or flourish, the capacity to experience those things matters. That's it. And one thing that reassures me is the sheer diversity of people who are quite comfortable with that statement, but yet have very different views about, what is sentience philosophically and scientifically, how widespread is it? Where should we draw the boundaries? And to my mind, I think you're right. We need to be careful about, is it binary or not? Is it graded or not? Is it, do simpler animals, for example, have less intense sentience or maybe more intense sentience than humans? Is it a simple dimensional thing you can mark from 0 to 10, or is it massively complex and multi-dimensional, which I think is much more likely, given the diversity of sentient experiences even within our own species? So I think that's dazzling, but that's partly why I quite like pairing this sentiocentrism, which I guess is saying, look, that capacity matters morally, with the naturalistic side, because what the naturalistic side says firstly is engage with reality honestly to try and work it out. So without bringing too many biases or warped or wishful thinking to the question, just assess it intelligently using a broad range of evidence. But it does mean that we should come to our credences about the nature of sentience and which entities have it in a way that is, provisional. So we're always open to new evidence, probabilistic. So we're never 100% sure. We'll always keep that open mind about plant sentience or whatever it is. But I think, to your point, importantly, there's a prudence there as well, because whenever we're doing something that has an ethical implication, we might be wrong about what we believe, but we might be wrong about our ethics as well. So it makes sense to give the benefit of the doubt to an extent and be prudent there too. So I think those are all important cautionary tales, because, as you say, there are some people who jump into a very simplistic view of sentience is binary and you're in and you're out, and
there's definitely a anthropocentrism about a lot of it as well. There's this little parable or joke that I heard as a teenager that has stuck with me since, that is about the story of the universe as told from the perspective of a worm, something like that. Talking about the formation of the cosmos and the Big Bang and all of this, and then the advent of life and evolution, and then it culminated in the worm. And that is that's
this is what it was all for.
Yeah,
we're at the pinnacle. We're at the pinnacle,
right?
Yeah.
So I think there's that is definitely a common pitfall for humans to succumb to. And
absolutely, yeah.
I think I see a lot of a lot of talk of measuring sentience in terms of how similar to humans they are, and I think that can be quite problematic. Even just measuring cognition or self-awareness and that sort of thing, at least within a certain scope, I'm not sure that makes much of a difference in terms of, ability to flourish and suffer. And, to your point about our, maybe some less complex or cognitively sophisticated beings, even more sentient, I think it can be really situational. If you were to, tell a rat a scary story, they are not going to be scared, But in our one of my previous houses, we had some rats in the basement causing problems, and we, caught them in a live trap and relocated them. But when I remember seeing this one that we caught in this live trap, just a little cage, and went down to get them and bring them to a field to release them. And I just remember seeing the sheer panic in their behavior of launching themselves into the side of the cage to try and escape, even if they're risking injuring themselves. And in a situation like that, a human might be able to make sense of the situation, be optimistic about their chances. They might be able to, rationalize some ways to get out. You could explain to them, this is only temporary. It's, for your own good. I don't have bad intentions. But just that sheer panic, that is something that we can relate to. And that just sense of terror that your life is possibly about to end and you don't know what to do. There's no reason to think that you need the cognitive sophistication of a great ape or a human in order to fully experience that that quality of emotion. So depending on the question and what the consequences are for different animals, maybe it doesn't matter that they're just a 10 on the scale of 1 to 10 in terms of sentience. I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I agree. And in a way, it's impossible to completely avoid the anthropocentric view just because of that's who we are. So sometimes I will describe, when I'm trying to get sentience across to people, I will start from my confidence in my own sentience as a point of reference, because it's a pretty solid one, right? It's one of the most things I'm most confident in, is that I am experiencing sentience, whatever that is, at the moment. So it's a point of reference. But at the same time, a scientific understanding makes it very, very clear that sentience predated humans by many millions of years, maybe 450, 550 million years. It's not a human thing. It's something that predates us. And when you look around even just our world, who knows if there are others with sentient life on, but even around our world, we're a vanishingly tiny percentage of all the sentient beings on Earth as well. So it's not a characteristic that is defined by how like us you are. But we need to remind ourselves of that, because us humans are very, very good at drawing everything back to ourselves. But that, in a way, that's partly why I quite like focusing on sentience rather than the term consciousness, because quite often people bundle extra stuff into consciousness and will say, well, a non-human animal isn't fully conscious because it doesn't have creativity or the ability to plan for the future or an advanced self-referential sense of the self or blah, 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 blah. Therefore, it's okay to harm them. And my rejoinder to that is, but the morally salient component of consciousness is the capacity to experience negative or positive things. And they definitely have that, and have had that for many millions of years. But again, that's a really important cautionary tale of just watching ourselves for anthropocentrism, because it's a strong, strange attractor for our minds.
I don't know if you're a sci-fi fan, but
yeah.
Or have you read Adrian Tchaikovsky?
Yes.
Yeah, I recently
Children of Time and
Children of Time and Children of Ruin. I find those extremely well done in general, just as stories, but the way that he explores different intelligences, different forms of intelligence, from the humans to spiders to octopuses to artificial intelligence to highly evolved ant colonies, to these truly alien forms of intelligence, I find really fascinating. It's a lot of obviously speculation and extrapolation, but I think the example of octopus is really salient here, because they have, part of their cognition happens not in their central brain, but in their arms, or tentacles, and
the crown and the reach.
Yeah, exactly. So, he illustrates the difference really well by speculating, well, what if they were, engineered to become highly intelligent and, even more intelligent than us? What would that look like, and what would that experience be? But I think it's a really good illustration just of the fact that our experience, while it is the starting point for our understanding of the world and our ability to empathize with others, is extremely specific to us, and that does not make it more valuable, and does not even necessarily make us more sentient than others. And that there's just the importance of taking a really open-minded, broad view of what sentience can look like.
And one of the things I love about sci-fi is how naturally that genre accords moral significance to non-human sentient beings. It's just sort of obvious, right? If this being seems to be sentient, and obviously there's some brilliant explorations of the boundaries of sentience and intelligence and so on. That, Star Trek is a classic example. And another recommendation for you is the author Peter Watts, who is again previous.
Yeah, I actually just heard a mention of him in one of your past episodes, and I
was lucky enough to interview him, and his book Blind Sight is a sort of very bleak, super hard sci-fi vision that explores some of these things too as well. So that's another one for your reading list. Yeah. I need to get onto this final crazily big question, which is how do we make a better world? Because I think we broadly share a sort of naturalistic view, although we might have a slightly different perspective. And maybe I'll catch up with you when I've tried mushrooms. We share a sort of a sentiocentric moral scope, although again, you're probably more comfortable going beyond that in a more generous way than I am. But we're roughly on the same sort of pages. But most of the human species disagrees with us on one or both of those axes at the moment, either because their compassion is more restricted to in-groups of humans, or even to all humans. They exclude many non-human sentient animals, or because they have an epistemology that, frankly, believes things that I think are fabricated or completely unfounded, and seem quite comfortable with that. So in that context, how do you think about the future and the capacity to make good things happen in the world, or drive positive change? And that's particularly in the context of your amazing 2-year journey, where you've been to so many different places around the world with different cultural backdrops, with different histories, with different focuses. I'm really interested in how that experience has adapted how you think about trying to do good in the world.
In terms of a vision for the future, I keep thinking of the movie Carnage. Have you seen that? It's like the future of Britain and a future vegan world, like fake documentary looking back on how we got to where we are. I find that very hilarious and actually quite insightful. But yeah, there's a scene where they develop technology that they put these like helmets on cows, and they're able to like translate their speech into like English. They're like, "Why are you doing this to us?"
Yeah. As if that message wasn't already obvious.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that it is a really interesting time in terms of the progression of views and just the landscape around veganism and our relationship with animals. One of the guys I met traveling, this older Australian guy, I volunteered on his nudist banana farm for a little while. My many random, bizarre, but lovely experiences traveling. He was talking to me about how, he went vegan many decades ago, and as a sort of hopeful, idealistic young person, he was thinking, by this time, probably 50% of the world will be vegan, hopefully, like that seems reasonable. And he was quite disappointed, obviously, and sort of demoralized after, decades of very slow progress. And I can relate with that. But at the same time, in the last 10 years or so have been absolutely crazy in terms of the amount of, awareness and discussion of veganism and animal ethics, as well as the development of plant-based meats and animal product alternatives, as well as the development of cultured meat, precision fermentation, and the like, to the point where we have a multi-million-dollar company's CEO saying he plans to make animal agriculture irrelevant by 2035. So the landscape is shifting very quickly, and that is one of the things that gives me hope, because there's a lot of people, unfortunately it's a common experience to hear people talking about basically how little they're willing to do or change in their lives for the sake of ethics or animal ethics. There's actually the traveling I just got back from. I was returning to this elephant sanctuary in Thailand, Elephant Nature Park, which is a absolutely incredible place. I made best friends with a baby water buffalo, and one of my favorite places in the world. They also have this amazing all vegan Thai buffet 3 times a day, and it's just a really pleasant place to be. But I remember one of the volunteers there saying, maybe I could give up meat if I could eat this buffet 3 times a day for the rest of my life. It's like literally you're saying, you're here volunteering to help animals. And you're saying the only way you could stop eating them is if somebody catered a feast for you, a vegan feast for you 3 times a day. That like you're literally not willing to do anything. And that can be really discouraging. And which is why I put some of my hope in these new technologies and businesses that are, looking to make animal product alternatives that are more delicious, more healthy, more sustainable, and cheaper.
Yeah, and that one anecdote I think provides 2 really important lessons. One is, people do change their minds and people are willing to make amazing commitments, but they're quite rare and it's very slow. So don't put too much store in persuasion or the weight of ethical argument. It doesn't mean we should keep trying, but don't put all of our eggs, using an appropriate phrase, in that basket. But at the same time, we have to find ways of making it easy for people to do the right thing. Hence, the 3 times a day buffet and the alternatives and the
right. If everybody in the world could just get a fully catered Thai vegan buffet 3 times a day, that would solve the problem. But yeah, making it easier for people. But another thing that I wrote about in the book was my mother's experience with shifting her diet as well. She actually went vegan. She's like 90% vegan still, however many years later. 6 years later, shortly before my trip. And, when she started, she was like, so what's this plant-based diet I keep hearing about? And I'm like, Mom, it's just veganism by a different name. It's like just a marketing term. It's like less offensive or controversial than vegan. And she's like, no, I think it's something else. And like, trust me, Mom, I know. Same thing. And she's like, well, I don't know. I heard it, might, have some health benefits. So I think I might try it. And, I had, been vegan for decades before that, had, had conversations with her about it. And, obviously didn't want to like, push or, try to like, make her change in a way she wasn't ready for. But anyway, after, a short while, probably a month or so, she had what she described as like a spiritual awakening, because as I was kind of mentioning, was like after you give yourself some distance between the experience of eating animal products, you're able to start thinking about it differently. And I think a little bit more honestly, and you're able to start dissolving this cognitive dissonance because you're no longer culpable in the consequences of animal products. And so you can look at those consequences a little more clearly. You're not so much protecting yourself in the same way. And so, she described to me going to this butcher shop. She was doing some elder care, taking care of somebody, and doing shopping for them. So she went to the butcher shop, and it was one that she went to before to shop for herself. And she was waiting in line and just looking at the case and thinking about these chunks of meat in the display case, and thinking, each of them were living, breathing animals who were alive. They were mooing and clucking and oinking and living their lives just, yesterday, perhaps. And now they're just, now it's just, that's worth $20 or whatever it is. And she left the store and she like wept on the sidewalk. And that is something, you can explain to people rationally, like, oh, like, you care about animals, you should stop eating meat. And it is so normal to have this cognitive dissonance to protect ourselves from that reality, that she wasn't able to even like think about it on those terms in a clear way until she had given herself distance, the distance of like not eating animal products for a while. That was pretty eye-opening to see that transition, for her to be able to, an older person who had been eating meat her whole life, to be able to go through that transition, and not just in terms of her habits, but in terms of her perspective. And I think that is encouraging, but it's difficult because I want to be pragmatic about, oh, well, obviously, if just explaining to people that pigs and cows and chickens are capable of suffering was enough to get them to change their behavior, then the world would be vegan by now. Like, the information is out there. So there's a lot of focus on, oh, well, let's just talk about the environmental impact of animal agriculture. Let's talk about the health impacts of eating meat, these sorts of things. And I really think that is dangerous. I don't know if that's an overstatement or not, to really go down that route. I think we need to learn how to speak with some like moral clarity about these things and some honesty about it. If there's some just moral travesty happening in the world, and think outside of our treatment of animals, some just clear moral tragedy, and we approach people and say, well, if we do the thing to avoid this tragedy, it's going to be a smaller carbon footprint. Like, that's just such a dishonest kind of way of speaking about it. When the reality is there is a torture and death happening on a scale that humans have not been capable of for most of our existence, that we are paying for. And we are literally internalizing the end product of that system, putting it in our bodies, and our bodies are then made of the products of this horror. That is a reality that I don't see like a clear path forward in the long run without coming to terms with that reality. And so if we can't learn how to talk about these things, like I said, with honesty and moral clarity, but also in a way that people are receptive to, which is a huge challenge. But if we can't figure that out, I think we're going to have some trouble moving forward.
Yeah. And I think I've spoken to people in this series of conversations who have all sorts of different theories of change or priorities or ways they think we can make things better, particularly in the non-human animal space. But I think that ethical thread has to run through them all. So even if we're using an environmental argument, or we're using a human health as zoonotic argument, or we're thinking about systemic changes, about taxes and subsidies and innovation and whatever those things are, and we probably do need a wide variety of different tools and techniques and approaches and campaigns, every single one needs to have that ethical thread at their core.
And it really is remarkable how bad we are doing at that. And not just animal advocates, but in general, people discussing these issues. It almost blows my mind how often I will see an article, because I read just about every article that pops up about, not just initiatives for, changing animal agriculture, but also, so many articles about cultured meat and plant-based meat development, and the number of articles that don't even mention the consequences of meat on the animals that are killed to produce that meat is remarkable to me. An article about how KFC is introducing a vegan version of their fried chicken into their 4,000 stores, and they talk about, oh, it's healthier and more environmentally friendly, and even they might even talk about how the it cuts down on pandemic risk, or they might even get into those sorts of things of zoonotic diseases. And maybe there's half a sentence where they just generally reference animal welfare or something like that, or more common, they'll say it's better for the world. It's a nice for the world, and you can't even name the animals whose lives are being literally spared by this introduction of this product or technology.
Whatever you do, don't mention the victims or their perspective. We cannot go there. It's shocking. In the same ways you described earlier on, we have our own personal cognitive dissonance as a way of protecting ourselves. We almost have a sort of societal level cognitive dissonance as well. It infects the editorial policies of the newspapers and the magazines and the websites that are having these conversations. It's just infused into the human way of thought.
I think people don't know how to talk about it, and I think it's because most people aren't used to really discussing ethics at all or in any depth.
There's almost an embarrassment about talking about ethics at all. Even in the human space, you can be accused of being righteous or preachy, or implying you're morally superior. So there's something embarrassing about talking about what's good and bad.
I'm not going to name names, but I was recently corresponding with the head of a company who is introducing animal products into their vegan food line. And it was a frustrating and remarkable exchange. But he was saying, I like vegans. I have vegans in my family. I have vegan friends. I just don't like the militant, shaming, holier than thou vegans.
Yeah.
And that's why, and I'm like, okay, I've heard this before. Maybe if you're a really online person, then the only vegans you talk to or see are the loudest, most obnoxious people on Twitter or something, which is true of any group of people, not just vegans. But he was saying, that's why I hate the approach of companies like Miyoko's and Beyond and Impossible. And I'm like, what are you even talking about? Miyoko, she puts a picture of herself hugging a cow on the side of the box. That's the only thing I can think of that's even a reference to ethics, much less is it shaming or in your face militant non-vegans are horrible people. It's literally just saying we should be nice to cows, and here's a beautiful, delicious product that can help you do that. And Impossible doesn't even claim that their product is vegan. Beyond never mentions animals in many of their marketing or anything like that. So and people are just so predisposed to this defensiveness, so predisposed to feeling any mention of even the existence of animal suffering or the suggestion that animals' interests should be considered is thought to be shaming.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because what that feels like to me. One, it is just a generic defense, right? Self-justification. And it's, the sort of thing I used for many years myself. But again, it's an indication of an unwillingness to engage with the perspective of the victim, because the judgment is, if vegans seem like a nice, friendly club I want to join, then I'll be vegan. But if vegans are annoying and preachy, then I won't join them. And the victims that we're talking about here are not in that conversation at all. It's literally about two groups of humans, and if vegans are annoying, then I'm not going to be vegan. It's like, but the point is the victim. And if you draw that analog across to human ethics, if someone said, look, I would like to believe in universal human rights, but some of those human rights advocates are really annoying and preachy, and they give off this vibe that they're morally superior.
Feel bad about myself for
I'm
not supporting human rights.
Yeah, so I'm going to go commit some war crimes because human rights advocates are really annoying. Again, it's that,
and that's why I think we need to learn how to speak with clarity and diplomatically, and in a way that is consistent and rational and compassionate. But we can't just run away from the conversation because we're afraid of people getting defensive, because that is unavoidable.
We can't sacrifice integrity and ethics in the pursuit of effectiveness, because I think we'll end up not being effective either. We have to be effective and have that ethical integrity at the same time.
The people who are ready and willing to really hear a message are going to hear it if it's delivered in a reasonable and diplomatic way. And those who are going to be defensive are going to be defensive regardless of how it's framed. So I think we need to learn how to do a little bit better in that regard. The other things that I would say, again, I think along these lines of continuing the discussion of ethics throughout our advocacy, is really the importance of empathy building. And obviously, I think that's important. I wrote a book about empathy, so it is really something I feel passionately about. And that was something that was really important and impactful in my experience traveling. Again, I volunteered at a bunch of different animal sanctuaries throughout my trip, and some of those were really remarkable experiences, volunteering with rescued monkeys and moon bears and camels and elephants, and getting a chance to be around these incredible animals that I had never even seen up close before was absolutely incredible. But also what was really striking to me was how transformed I was by my experience with farmed animals at these sanctuaries as well. And I realized that even though I had, been vegan for many years before that point, my idea of pigs, for instance, was still an abstraction. It was based a little more in reality of knowing that they are as intelligent or more intelligent than dogs, and that they are sentient beings who can suffer and flourish. Like, I knew those things logically. It wasn't so simplistic as a childhood book that says a pig goes oink, but still, this sanctuary in particular, called Mino Valley Farm Sanctuary in northern Spain, they had about 40 pigs there, and I interacted with them quite a bit, and it was really transformed my view of them from this abstraction into a more nuanced, reality-based idea of who pigs are, and learning all of their different vocalizations. And they are just so communicative, and it's not just the pigs go oink. They have like a dozen different like vocalizations. This one that really stuck with me is just this, it's almost like a very faint, almost a whispered like squeak, like high-pitched squeak, that as far as I can tell is just an expression of contentedness. And to hear, pigs like rooting around in the leaves and the sun, in their new safe enclosure, making this contented little squeak. The experiences like that, that really, it made these logical sort of ethical conclusions I'd come to a little more real and visceral. And I think, long story short, that really informed my sort of transformation and decisions through the later parts of the trip and coming home to abandon my architecture career and decide to, commit myself to trying to maximize the good that I can do in the world. Just briefly, another concept I wanted to mention, there's a sanctuary / organic farm in northern India called People Farm. It's Peepal, as in the people tree, which is a really remarkable place. I had some great discussions with Robin, one of the co-founders there, and he introduced me to this concept of a suffering footprint, which is, the totality of suffering that I'm responsible for, basically. And, thinking of veganism or his ethical framework as trying to minimize his suffering footprint. So, of course, that involves not eating animal products, but also just generally reducing his consumption. They also have like a no-till organic farm that they develop there, so they can grow as much of their own food, sort of minimizing the collateral damage of plant agriculture and whatnot. But this idea is basically that, as a sort of basis for ethics, is if I have a suffering footprint, no matter what I do, then of course I can do what I can to reduce and minimize that footprint. But if others must suffer for me to live, then my life is not mine alone. And so that is the basis for thinking about a sort of duty or responsibility to have a positive role in the world. And so that's been kind of my guiding framework since then, is essentially trying to have the joy and pleasure that I bring to the world be larger than my suffering footprint. So that is, I think that's my approach. But getting back to your question, there's another thing I wanted to mention is that I think is also under discussed, is the role of, this might be a loaded term, but toxic masculinity. Again, speaking of articles that don't mention the obvious, read any article about a mass shooter or a murder or assault, and I challenge you to find one article that mentions that it's all men who are doing these things. And even, I would venture to say that it's mostly men who are, hurting and killing animals in animal agriculture and rodeos and circuses and all of this. And, it's not exclusive, but it's certainly pair that with the fact that, something like 80% of vegans are women. I think it's, to our detriment to ignore the role of sort of patriarchal, masculine expectations and culture, and this idea that as men, are the way that we define ourselves as real men, which is an expression I despise, is that we are tough and strong, and that empathy and kindness are forms of weakness. And I think that is so detrimental to the world in so many ways. And so obviously that is an enormous problem to address. Certainly not one that I feel particularly qualified to do, but I think that, as I said, it's to our detriment and to the detriment of animals as well, for us to ignore that.
Yeah. I mean, if we're gonna honestly diagnose the cultural and psychological problems we're facing, that has to be part of the thinking, and the correlations are pretty powerful, pretty strong. Like you say, there's themes of domination, control, ownership, and I think a strong part of that sort of hesitation and shame about caring that play through that dynamic as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
Well,
so yeah, I don't know, how all these things are going to be tied together or can be tied together. But like I said, I'm quite encouraged by what's transpired over the last 5 or 10 years, and for the first time, since I was a idealistic teenager, I'm starting to have some hope that it's within our grasp to make the world a much better place.
Yeah, well, that's an optimistic note to try and draw things to a close. And I took some of that optimism from your book, The Weight of Empathy, too, because you travel through so many different cultures, different countries, and in each of those, the context, the history, and the solutions are going to have to be different too, because of the cultures and because of the practical reality on the ground and the psychology. But you found compassion and empathy everywhere you traveled in different forms, with ancient historical and cultural roots that are very diverse. But that core is there, right? We all have that capacity for empathy and compassion, and I think there is a great deal of hope there. So
I think so.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone to read your book. It's beautiful in at least 3 ways. I mean, photographically, the pictures are captivating. Your writing is beautiful too. But the most important aspect is your compassion personally that shines through on every page. So yeah, thank you for sending me a copy.
Appreciate that.
Highly recommend everybody read it. What's the best way of people following you, learning more about your plans? Do you do any social media? Finding The Weight of Empathy, of course.
Yeah, the best way to find the book is just through my website, weightofempathy.com. If you're in the US, you can order a copy of the paperback. Which I'll just grab a copy right here. It's a nice large format book. Since we're on video, I can show you a little bit. But with lots of nice
stunning
photos from my travels. Anyway, you can order a copy on weightofempathy.com. Also, there's an ebook version, and I have the ebook version is priced at on a pay what you want basis. So you can just hit or leave it at 0 at checkout and download it for free if you'd like. And you can come back later and leave me a tip if you want or not. So yeah, I want it to be accessible to people. And it's, shipping overseas is a lot, but it's pretty affordable in the States. Otherwise, you can follow me on Instagram. Earth and Eats is my handle. And yeah, I try and use that thoughtfully and post things that are interesting and meaningful rather than just putting out a lot of content. But yeah, I'd appreciate if anyone wants to get in touch or check out my book.
That's great. And I'll put the links in the show notes so people can click through. Well, it's been an inspiration. It's a privilege to hear your personal journey and story. And it's great to hear that as you're in Oregon, you're going to connect up with another previous guest, David Mickelson.
Absolutely.
On his Yes on IP initiative. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I think you've got a chance of taking Oregon even beyond Palatana. It could become the first sanctuary state. Let's see.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Lucas.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I've
take
really
care and
enjoyed
stay in
this.
touch.
Thank you so much. All right, you too.